before transit was taken over by the government, which is basically in the decade from about 1965 to 1975, transit moved about 59,000 people per operating employee. Today it moves about 26,000 people per operating employee. It's a 54% reduction in worker productivity. You don't see that kind of reduction in any industry except for industries that have been taken over by the government with all the inefficiencies that result. Now, traditionally, when you ask why do we subsidize transit, they'll give you answers like, well, it's environmentally sound, or it helps poor people. Well, it turns out neither of those are particularly true anymore. The number of poor people riding transit to work has been rapidly declining because they've been getting cars. The fastest growth in transit ridership is among people who earn more than $75,000 a year. Since about 2006, the average income of transit riders has been much greater than the average income of Americans as a whole, American workers as a whole. And so transit is now something for the wealthy to use. So why do we need to give it $51 billion in subsidies a year? Despite all of these subsidies, transit's share of travel has been steadily declining. Transit agencies were thrilled when, does this have a, whatever, thrilled when the 2008 financial crisis led to a slight decline in per capita driving, but that was very temporary. It's now going up again rapidly, and transit ridership is flat or declining. The average income of transit commuters has been growing, and the median income today is higher than the median income of all commuters. And as for transit being good for the environment, that's true. In New York City, San Francisco, Portland, and Honolulu, transit uses less energy than driving. In every other urban area in America, transit uses more energy than driving, and in some cases a lot more. Dallas, which is proud for having built the nation's largest network of light rail lines, uses almost 50% more energy, uses more than 50% more energy to move a passenger mile than driving an SUV. Los Angeles, Boston, Washington, they're all very energy inefficient compared to driving. So transit is the brown form of travel, not the green form of travel. Now, with apologies to John Oliver, I have to ask, how is this still a thing? Streetcars. Streetcars were made obsolete 80 years ago, and now we're seeing cities all over the country install streetcars because they think if they have a Disneyland ride, they're going to attract millennials to want to work there. It doesn't seem to be working. It costs a lot of money. They're spending $50 to $100 million a mile building these streetcars, and most of the cities that have built them don't even dare charge a fare because they know if they charge fares, they're going to get even fewer riders than they already get. So Washington, D.C. has the H Street streetcar. They don't even have a fare collection system installed because they don't think they're ever going to charge fares for it. How is light rail still a thing? Light rail is really streetcars, except for you can couple several of them together to make a little bit longer trains. But we're spending $200 million a mile on average building new light rail lines. You can build a 4-lane freeway for $20 million a mile. So $200 million a mile, and each light rail line typically moves about a third as many people as a single freeway lane per day. It's extremely expensive. All it really does is it lines the pockets of contractors. Is this still a thing? Big 40-passenger buses. Years ago, the average bus held about 15 passengers over the course of a day. Today, we're down to 9 passengers on a bus over the course of a day. It might be a little more during rush hour, and it's going to be less the rest of the day. And as Jared will tell you, it doesn't make sense to swap out your buses in the middle of the day and go for a smaller bus later in the day and a bigger bus earlier in the day. But still, you are running big buses, and why? It's partly because the federal government gives transit agencies 80% of the cost of buying a bus, or 90% of the cost if it's a clean energy bus, meaning propane or battery or electricity. And So we're running empty buses all over the place, and I think that's totally unnecessary. This is the thing. If you want to save energy, get yourself a plug-in hybrid, which is what Waymo is buying for its driverless cars. If you want to help poor people, give them a car. This is a woman named Lynette Watkins. She didn't have a job. She had a couple of kids. And an organization called Ways to Work in Wisconsin gave her a low-interest loan for her first car. And she was able to get a job. And now she's got steady employment and is taking care of her kids. And because a car gives her access to a lot more jobs than she would have had if somebody had given her a free transit pass. So my argument is we need to end all subsidies to transit. We should end all subsidies to all forms of transportation, but if you took away the penny subsidy per mile from drivers, and if you took away the 89-cent subsidy per mile to transit, it would shift transit riders' preferences more than it would shift auto drivers' preferences. But you'd still have transit. We have private transit today. A company called Chariot, which is owned by the Ford Motor Company, is competing against public transit agencies in San Francisco, New York, and 8 other cities across the country. There are other private transit companies where they are allowed to operate, and many cities don't allow private transit companies to compete against the public agencies, but where they are allowed to operate, they offer better service and sometimes not that much more. Chariot's advertising $3 for a bus ride. That's probably more than San Francisco Muni charges, but it might be more reliable and it might be more comfortable. So if we eliminated subsidies to transit, we'd still have it where it was needed, but we wouldn't have it where it's just a big pork barrel project. Almost everything I've said today is in the paper that you have, so I encourage you to read that. I'll encourage you to come next Wednesday, where we'll have a forum for my new book, Romance of the Rails. I personally love passenger trains. I'm actually rather obsessed with passenger trains, and so it was fun to write this book. I hope you'll enjoy taking a look at it, and I look forward to your questions later this afternoon.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate Randall actually having the initiative to set this up and inviting me to exchange ideas with him here, and really welcome the opportunity to speak with the Cato Institute. I spent lots of time talking to people who basically agree with me, and so I hope we can have some great interchanges with people who have genuinely different perspectives here. You notice my title here is Transit Why and Where, and where matters a lot. And my presentation is mostly going to be about that. But let me clarify a few things to help sort of define the shape of my actual disagreement with Randall, because there are actually many things we agree on. I'm somebody who works every day to make transit better. The definition of better is what the local transit agency board values, which is presumably what they as elected officials are representing the values of the community. That's not necessarily ridership. One of the things I do working with transit agencies is to encourage them to think clearly about what part of their service is actually aimed at ridership, because a large part of it isn't. If I had to guess, based on the studies I've done, somewhere between 50 and 60% of all the transit service in the United States is actually seeking high ridership. The rest of it is doing a number of other things that are very important, which broadly speaking I would call coverage. The easiest way to explain coverage is that if I were hired to come in and design a transit system that maximized ridership, I would delete a whole lot of services that are in places and at times where ridership is not a realistic expectation. And when I do that, the people who depend on those services will come down to the board meeting, and there will be day after day after day of horrible hearings that the board will have to sit through. And understandably, they, as local officials, will make judgments about how important ridership really is in the face of these people's needs. So that's called the ridership coverage trade-off. I wrote the first academic paper on it. Google that topic, and you'll see a lot of what's been written. But remember, when you evaluate transit ridership, that only a little more than half of all transit is trying to do that. Much of it is trying to do other things, and it's up to local boards to decide what those priorities should be. Let's start with the political reality of transit because it tells us something important. If we have any sort of regional or state transit referendum and you do a precinct map of the results, you get a map of residential density. Slightly inflected by education. More educated people tend to support transit more. I see that over and over in referenda. And I suggest we think of that not as a result of the fact that people in cities are just incorrigible and irredeemable liberals. I suggest we see that as people in different places trying to solve the problem of their place and the problems that arise in their daily lives as urban residents, as suburban residents, or as rural residents. And so what we see always is that dense cities are absolutely screaming about transit. Randall mentioned Seattle. You're going to go nowhere in Seattle city politics if you are not absolutely rabid about improving transit. You're not going to get off the ground. Suburban intercity also is generating a lot of concern for transit about the long commutes between suburbs because even though density may not be that high, people have to travel such a long distance that they consume a lot of road space if they're in cars. And that's why suburban freeways tend to get congested, even if suburban local streets are not. So we have this problem of spatial efficiency, which is an urban problem. Because what is a city? A city is not very much space per person. A city is lots of people living close together, therefore it's not very much space per person. The shortage of space is the defining feature of a city. Social needs also are a different purpose of transit. This is slightly like the ridership coverage trade-off, although not entirely. And so, of course, also you hear about those more from urban residents than from rural residents. And I have my own theory about that, which is that the sufferings of the unfortunate are simply more visible to urban people. Once you walk down the street and encounter the homeless, and encounter, all the other things you encounter, you inevitably have experiences of empathy that arise from actually being in the immediate presence of someone else's misfortune. And that's an experience you're just less likely to have in rural life. It's even something you can have a lot less of in suburban life if your life is basically that when you are in public, you are in your car. So that's why the politics looks like this, and I think we have to look at this politics not in the lens of a liberal conservative or libertarian socialist trade-off, but in the context of people understandably addressing the problems of where they live. And that, I argue, is why we should be completely bored by national transit statistics. Because what matters is not national averages of anything. What matters is what's going on in people's actual communities where they live. Now, the other thing you're going to notice in my presentation is that I'm not going to talk very much about history. I'm not going to show any time series charts about trends. And that's because I am a philosophical skeptic. The title of this event is The Future of Public Transit. I'm going to be very disciplined about describing the future. I'm only going to describe things I'm absolutely sure about. But I believe, and one of the interesting pieces of work I've been involved in, I believe that we can say a lot more about the future if we confine ourselves to things that we are absolutely sure about. And that in particular, I've done work suggesting that if we think about personal freedom as an outcome of transportation